Etsy knows these aren't the sounds of holiday gifting.
Oh.
Well, not the ones you're hoping for.
Okay. Thank you?
You want squeals of delight.
Yes!
And spontaneously written songs of joy.
I am so happy. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah.
To get those, make everyone on your list feel heard with gifts like personalized jewelry, custom artwork, vintage pieces, and home decor. For original gifts that say, I get you, Etsy has it.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
The Athletic. Hello, friends, and welcome back to And Colossally, That's History, the podcast that reappraises motor racing history. My name is Matt Bishop, and I'm here once again with my good friend Richard Williams. How are you doing, Richard?
I'm very well, thank you, Matt. But before we get going with this week's episode, I have one thing to clear up.
Really?
Yes. We're very fortunate to have received some extremely lovely messages and reviews on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, but in one of them, a listener in Denmark commented on being, quote, a bit perplexed about what an anorak fact is. Now, you introduced this term to the pod, so for the benefit of our international audience, would you care to explain?
Was it Kevin Magnussen, by the way?
His second cousin.
Well, it's all about train spotters, people who spend their leisure time on railway platforms recording railway locomotives' numbers in a notebook or presumably nowadays digitally. Typically, such men, and they are usually men, aren't they, to be fair, traditionally, they wear anoraks, in other words, waterproof jackets. So, over time, train spotters became known as anoraks. So, anorak is a friendly term, I want to make that clear, and its extended meaning now encompasses anyone who follows their hobby with diligent, or dare I say it, obsessive attention to detail. Now, I'm not ashamed to say that I'm a Formula One anorak. So when we announce a fact that only people who have an obsessive devotion to Formula One could know, or could even be interested in, we call it an anorak fact. What do you think, Richard? Do you think that's cleared it up?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I've always thought that people who wear anoraks are showing themselves to be practical and not vain, which is fair enough. I mean, that sums you up and probably me too. There we are.
I see myself in that description.
Anyway, we'll have a few more anorak facts on today's pod, which is all about the golden generation of French drivers who came into bloom, as it were, between the late 1960s and the early 1980s. And it's a remarkable story, really, because after going 13 years without a victory at all in the Formula One World Championship, that's from 1958 to 1971, France then had 10 different winners in the next 11 years. And that's considerably more than any other nation during that period, as a new generation of driving talent burst through almost en masse. Many of them, as it happens, called Jean-Pierre.
Quite a few. We'll come to them all.
We will. We'll discuss who these drivers were and how there came to be so many of them in such a short space of time.
Mais oui. Yes, we will. And, as you say, it's a great list. We're talking about people like, Patrick Depailler, Jacques Laffite, Didier Pironi, Rene Arnoux, and of course Alain Prost, and quite a few more, all of whom are household names to people who know their motor racing. Anoraks, in other words. So, now, as we record this podcast in late 2024, there are two French drivers on the current 20-car Formula One grid, Esteban Ocon and Pierre Gasly. And that feels right. Well, it feels right that there should be some, and two's a good number, because although no nation has a divine right to expect to have any drivers on the Formula One grid, France is often considered to be the ancestral home, if we can call it that, of Grand Prix racing. We don't call it Grand Prize racing, do we? It's Grand Prix racing. For it was in France where the roots of the sport we all know and love today really took hold, wasn't it, Richard?
Yes, it was. At the very beginning of the 20th century, the French public fell in love with the motor car, and racing was a natural extension of that romance. The very first race to carry the title Grand Prix was organised by the Automobile Club de France, the ACF, in 1906, and it was held over a 63-mile circuit laid out between villages on the outskirts of the city of Le Mans. And naturally enough, in the early years of Grand Prix racing, French manufacturers and drivers were plentiful, and so was success. Of the car makers, Bugatti became the star name, but you also had Delage, Delahaye, Peugeot, and Renault, who'd actually won that first Grand Prix at Le Mans.
In 1906.
In 1906. And on the driver front, you had people like André Boillot, Robert Benoit, Jules Gou, Philippe Étincelin, Jean-Pierre Vermeulen, Raymond Sommer, and René Dreyfus, all big names of the time.
Well pronounced, that little spree of names, Richard, by the way.
Well, between them, they won countless Grand Prix, Le Mans 24 Hours, and even the Indianapolis 500. But in the 1930s, the French Grand Prix teams got overtaken by the Italian and German manufacturers, the likes of Alfa Romeo and Maserati, and then the unbeatable Mercedes-Benz and Auto Union. And many of the best French drivers of the time, people like Vermeulen, of course lost the best years of their career to the Second World War. And we should talk about them a bit before moving on to more recent history. In fact, Robert Benoit, who'd won 4 major Grand Prix for Delage in 1927 alone, actually didn't survive the war. He was captured by the Germans in 1944 after working for the British SOE on espionage operations, and he was executed at the Buchenwald concentration camp. He'd been arrested along with his SOE colleague, William Grover, the British Bugatti driver, who'd won the first Monaco Grand Prix in 1929 and who was also executed. There were survivors of the conflict among the drivers, and they included Raymond Sommer, who was twice a winner at Le Mans in the 1930s. He was said to have shot down a Luftwaffe plane with his rifle and later escaped from a POW camp. Jean-Pierre Vermeulen and his wife stored guns and explosives for the resistance, and on one occasion he managed to escape a German raid on their house by submerging himself in a nearby stream.
Extraordinary stories, aren't
Isn't
they?
it just?
Yes.
They are amazing stories.
They are.
As for Vermeulen in particular, there's no doubt that he'd have been a major star of post-war racing. He was a really top talent. He won the big race at the first meeting after the hostilities were over, which was held at the Bois de Boulogne in Paris, and he was recruited by Alfa Romeo to join their super team in 1946, winning 5 of the 9 Grand Prix he started in the Alfetas. But very sadly, he was killed in 1949 during practice for the Buenos Aires Grand Prix, mourned not only by his widow, but by Juliette Greco, the 22-year-old singer who was the darling of the left-bank existentialists at the time, and with whom he was having an affair.
Goodness.
Had he survived, and had he driven for Alfa Romeo in 1950, as he almost certainly would have done, it might well have been him, and not Nino Farina, who became the first Formula One world champion.
The first Formula One what might have been story, you could say.
Indeed so,
Yeah.
But instead, when the World Championship began in 1950, French cars and drivers were quite thin on the ground. Talbot was the main French manufacturer of note to begin with, and then Gordini, but they couldn't compete with the Alfas, Maseratis or Ferraris, and later the Mercedes. And on the driver front, France did have still a handful of pretty good Formula One drivers in the 1950s. There was Louis Rosier, who was on Grand Prix podiums a couple of times in 1950 in a Works Talbot, and had his last race at the Nürburgring in 1956, finishing 5th in his own Maserati at the age of 50. And there was Maurice Trintignant, of course, who was nicknamed Le Patoulet, rat droppings, after the substance that had to be cleared out of his pre-war Bugatti's petrol tank when he got it out of storage in 1945.
Bit unfortunate.
Rat droppings.
Yes.
Now there's an anorak fait for you, Matt, because the French for anorak is, in fact, anorak. But although Trintignant was useful enough to win the Monaco Grand Prix twice, in 1955 for Ferrari, and again in 1958 in a Cooper, he and Rosier weren't at the level of the likes of Juan Manuel Fangio, Alberto Ascari, or Stirling Moss. But France did have one Grand Prix driver who stood out alongside the very best of the time, and that was Jean Behra. Tell us about him, Matt.
Thank you. Jean Behra, yes. He never won a World Championship status Formula One Grand Prix, although he raced in 52 of them, which was quite a lot in the 1950s. I mean, more than Fangio. Fangio raced in 47. And he, Behra, stood on 9 World Championship status Formula One Grand Prix podiums. But non-championship Formula One races were a big thing in the 1950s and in the 1960s as well. And Behra won 12 of them. 12. He was a brilliant driver, but erratic. When he was on it, he was magnificent, leaving no margin anywhere, and no one was quicker than he on those days. But when he wasn't in the right mood, he was a bit lackluster. He was a temperamental chap, wasn't he, Richard, really?
Yes, he was, which is one of the things that made him rather likeable.
Very much
like a bit of temperament.
And yes, and as I say, he left no margin, and he did have a lot of shunts as a result. He was scarred all over his body, in fact, from his many shunts. Have you seen that photograph of him with the captions all over his body? He's standing wearing a pair of shorts, and there's captions pointing out each different cut, bruise, and imperfection.
Sounds like a bit of a collector's item to me.
Yeah.
There you go.
You can find it online. It's worth having a look at. Anyway, where were we? Yes, so he's scarred all over his body from his many shunts. And, you know, in the 1955 Dundrod TT in Northern Ireland, his ear was ripped off in one of them, ripped clean off. It wasn't only Niki Lauda who had that happen. Anyway, more than that, or as well as that, Behra was famously argumentative, and he was famously fired by Enzo Ferrari for punching the Ferrari team manager Romolo Tavoni in the face in a restaurant at Reims in 1959, or more specifically for refusing to apologise to Tavoni for having done so.
I imagine there have been a few Ferrari drivers over the years who would have liked to have punched their team managers, but
for sure
restrained themselves.
We can either try and think of one each now, or we can do another podcast another time. I'll give you one. Jody Scheckter felt like punching Marco Piccinini at Monza in 1979 when Piccinini said, "Oh, by the way, there's going to be a protest. Our car might not be legal." And Scheckter said, "What?" And he went, "No, I was only joking." Which
that famous South African sense of humour.
Scheckter was not amused. He was not amused. I'm sure he felt like punching them, but he didn't because he wasn't like Behra. Anyway, when Behra was killed at Aarhus in Germany in a Porsche, which tragedy took place just 4 weeks after he'd lamped Tavoni at Reims, France was left without a truly top-line Formula One driver. And, in fact, as we've already mentioned, France would go 13 years without a win in the Formula One World Championship, which is between Trintignant and Cevert. Remarkable, considering the interest in the sport in France. So, how did France come to have so many Formula One Grand Prix winners in the 1970s and 1980s then? Well, that's kind of the subject of this podcast, and there were a few factors. But I think the one we have to talk about first is the Winfield Racing School and its associated scholarships.
Yes, racing schools became a thing in the 1950s when Jim Russell, a British driver who'd seen quite a lot of success in the old 500cc Formula 3 in particular, set up the first ever institution of that type at the Snetterton circuit on an old airfield in Norfolk in 1957. And the Jim Russell Racing School was extraordinarily successful. In fact, Emerson Fittipaldi, the great Brazilian double Formula One champion, came through it, as did another F1 champion, Jacques Villeneuve, and so, with rather less distinction, did I.
That really is an anorak fact, Richard.
No, I'd call it something quite different, but there we are. Anyway, Russell had even helped train the actors for the 1966 film Grand Prix, which we talked about a couple of episodes back. So, though he might not get lots of acclaim, Jim, who died in 2019 at the very impressive age of 98, was a highly influential man in international motorsport. A visionary, you might say. And not only did he help launch the careers of many British drivers of note, he also played a big part in kickstarting the rise of France's golden generation, because it was his blueprint, as well as his name, that was used to start the first French school of open-wheel motor racing at Manicourt in 1963. And it was a chap called Bill Knight, a businessman who was a racing driver and a land speed record enthusiast, who was the guy to approach Russell, as they'd rubbed shoulders plenty of times over the years. And indeed, Bill's son, Mike, who was another racer, had attended the Jim Russell School himself. The journalist Gérard Crombach, a prominent figure in the French racing scene, was involved in identifying Manicourt as a potential venue for the new project. Jabby, as everyone knew him, was a very well-connected man. In 1962, he'd founded the monthly magazine Sport Auto, which is still going today. He was particularly close to the Lotus team, and he was sharing a flat in Paris with Jim Clark when Jim died in 1968. And if you don't mind a little digression, Matt, my favourite memory of Jabby is of the time during a race weekend at Monaco in the 90s, when we strolled together down the hill from the Mirabeau corner to what I still insist on calling the station hairpin. He told me the story of the time when he and his girlfriend had taken the train back to Paris with Stirling Moss after the race. It might have been 1961 when Stirling beat the Ferraris. Anyway, the three of them caught the train. And by the time they got to Paris, the arrangements had changed. As Jabby put it, my girlfriend was no longer my girlfriend. But he didn't bear a grudge. I mean, it was Stirling, wasn't it?
He wasn't the first person to lose to Stirling. But it's a great story.
That's a nice way of putting it.
Anyway, it's a great story. It's a great story. And I was very glad to have overlapped with Jabby in Formula One, which I did, because he died in 2005. I was the editor of F1 Racing magazine at that time, and he'd actually been very helpful to me in my early days. I'd taken on the editorship of F1 Racing in 1996, and I gave it up when I joined McLaren in 2008. F1 Racing was a new magazine in 1996, and I think maybe Jabby saw parallels between my challenges and the challenges he'd faced in the 1960s when he'd set up Sport Auto. He was Swiss, actually, not French. He was big in France, but he was Swiss. And I remember him once telling me, well, I can tell you a little Jabby story as well. I can remember him once telling me about the 1936 Swiss Grand Prix, which had been won by Bernd Rosemeyer in an auto union. Of course I was there, he added nonchalantly. May not be the best impersonation, but he had that mixture of posh English and Francophile, didn't he? Anyway, your silence suggests that you're not impressed.
No, I'm very impressed.
Anyway, he had indeed been there, age 7. I mean, what a life he led.
That is fantastic, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, he was just one of those people you knew a bit, you saw around, you talked to, and he just embodied so much of the history of the sport.
Absolutely.
Particularly in the years after the
For
war.
years, he held the record for the number of Grand Prix attended, didn't he? Which I think
he did, yeah.
Which I think has now been eclipsed. But because there are 20-something races a year, which there used to be so many fewer.
Yes, it's like comparing Verstappen with Fangio, isn't it? The statistics and
another podcast.
Anyway, in 1963, Jabby directed the racing school people towards Manicourt, which is around 250 kilometres from Paris, in a very rural location, with a circuit backed by the enthusiastic mayor of the local town. The school was initially named L'École de Pilotage Jim Russell, but it was renamed L'École de Pilotage Winfield, the Winfield Racing School, in 1963, when first Bill Knight and then his son Mike took over the running of the school from Russell. I'm not entirely sure why Winfield was the name they used. I'm pretty certain it wasn't anything to do with the brand of cigarettes that sponsored the Williams team through a couple of rather unsuccessful years in the 1990s.
I'm damn sure it wasn't that.
No. But I think it was used by Knight in some of his other business ventures, which included a go-kart track in Mallorca.
Yes, and a big part of the Winfield School from the off, really, was this scholarship element, which essentially gave backing to the best driver each year to progress in their career. From 1963 to 1973, the award was sponsored by Shell Fuels, and known as the Volant Shell, the Shell steering wheel. The trophy was actually a mounted steering wheel. Then from 1974 onwards, it became known as the Volant Elf, after the French oil giant, which sponsored the Tyrrell team in Formula One and helped set up a Winfield school, a second Winfield school in France at the Paul Ricard circuit in Provence, where it still has its headquarters, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And just to say a bit more about ELF, which some people say stands for Essence Lubricant Français, although others dispute that and say the name was an entirely random coinage. I don't know.
Named after elves. Why not?
Well, either elves or I'm going with Essence Lubricant Français because it's quite logical, isn't it?
Okay.
Anyway, from its very beginnings, ELF used motor racing as a means of promotion. And Francois Guittet, the firm's famous marketing manager, was really the driving force behind all of that. But anyway, to get back to the point, as we mentioned earlier, straight away the school started to produce drivers of some note, of some acclaim. The first winner of the Volant Shell was Jean-Pierre Jabouille, who went on to win the Le Mans 24 Hours twice, and in my view, he was a much underrated driver, quick in single-seaters, actually, in his youth, Formula 3, etc. Anyway, the first intake in 1963 also included a guy called Johnny Servoz Gavin, who was apparently thrown off the course, but was good enough to lead the Monaco Grand Prix in 1968 in a Matra before he crashed, and to finish second at Monza before an eye injury led him to retire from the sport. But a great story, when asked why he had retired so young, at just 28 in fact, he replied, to devote more time to women.
Mais oui.
Anyway, the list of top graduates from the Winfield School over the next 10 or 12 years reads like a who's who of French motor racing. Where do we start? Well, Jean-Pierre Jabouille, Jumper, as he was known.
Jumper Jabouille,
absolutely, was part of the 1965 crop, for example. Now, he never won a Formula One Grand Prix, but he started 132 of them, taking 3 pole positions and 3 third places. Not bad at all. He was pretty quick.
Mm-hmm.
He was pretty quick. And he lest we forget, he all but won the 1978 Canadian Grand Prix, which of course was actually won by Gilles Villeneuve, his maiden Formula One victory. But Jabouille all but won it because he'd been deputising for the recently deceased Ronnie Peterson in his Lotus 79. And Jabouille outclassed his teammate, who was the newly crowned Formula One world champion Mario Andretti. And but for an oil leak that ended his run when he'd built up a fine lead, Jumper would have won that race easily. But the driver who properly kick-started the golden generation from Winfield was Francois Cevert, who beat Patrick Depailler, another driver whom we'll discuss shortly, to the Volant Shell in 1966, which entitled him to a fully sponsored drive in French Formula 3 in 1967.
Matt, a lot of these French drivers had their share of charisma, but Cevert was pretty special even by their standards, wasn't he?
Pretty special in every way, actually, Richard. Yes, I don't know whether you teed me up to say this, but yes. Handsome with famously beautiful blue eyes, charming, a fine pianist, a paramour of Brigitte Bardot, who, for younger listeners, was, of course, a model, a singer and an actress, and one of the most glamorous pin-ups of the 1960s.
In fact, John Lennon married his first wife because she looked a bit like Brigitte Bardot, if I remember.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
But Cevert got there, whereas Lennon didn't.
That's absolutely right.
But more relevant for us, Cevert was also very quick. Now, the Tyrrell F1 team was sponsored by Elf at the time, as we've said, but it would be wrong to say that Cevert was signed because the French sponsor wanted a French driver, although it probably helped. Actually, as Ken Tyrrell tells it, it was Jackie Stewart, his lead driver, who recommended Cevert to Ken Tyrrell as a replacement for Johnny Servoz-Gavin, who was also spending too much time looking after women as well. They had that much in common. And naturally, Elf were delighted. But anyway, Cevert and his new Tyrrell teammate Stewart became extremely good friends. Cevert looked upon Stewart as a mentor and, to his great credit, Jackie accepted the role generously and graciously, passing on as much of his knowledge as he possibly could. And Francois was an enthusiastic and grateful pupil. And when Jackie Stewart told Ken Tyrrell privately that he planned to retire at the end of the 1973 season, they, Jackie and Ken, decided to ready Francois Cevert to take over as the team's number one driver. And that was an important role because Tyrrell was a super successful team in those days. Severt's teammate was to be, someone we've already mentioned, Jody Scheckter. So it was a wicked irony that in qualifying for the last Grand Prix of the Formula One year, 1973, at Watkins Glen, which would have been Stewart's 100th Grand Prix start, it was Scheckter, then in a McLaren, who saw ahead of him a Tyrrell in two halves. Jody stopped to try to help, and as I've said before on this podcast, what he saw, he's told me, will stay with him forever. For not only was the car in two halves, but so was its driver. It was Cevert.
A very sudden end and a very sad one. But we must go on, as F1 did at the time, and we should probably now talk about Patrick Depailler, who, as we mentioned earlier, was beaten to the annual Winfield School Award by Cevert, but in the strange twist of fate that you've just described, Matt, ended up filling the suddenly vacant seat at Tyrrell for 1974, alongside Jody Scheckter. For it was Patrick Depailler who took Francois Cevert's place.
Yes, it was. Patrick Depailler actually had been inspired to race by Jean Behra, his childhood hero. Both of them started out racing motorcycles, actually, and eerily, we can say eerily, Depailler would go on to suffer a similar fate as his hero, Behra, dying at the wheel of a Formula One car in Germany on August the 1st. Extraordinary coincidence. It was a Porsche on August the 1st, 1959 in Behra's case, and an Alfa Romeo on August the 1st, 1980 in Depailler's case.
Depailler was actually a native of Clermont-Ferrand, the home of a wonderful circuit, and it was there that he competed in his first Grand Prix for the Tyrrell team in 1972. He'd driven in Formula 3 for Alpine Renault, and then in F2 with the Elf-sponsored Pygmée and Techno teams. And he was already 28 when Elf's sponsorship helped him get his drive with Ken Tyrrell. In 5 full seasons with Tyrrell, he took quite a few podiums and the first ever pole position by a French driver in a World Championship Formula One race. That was at Anderstorp in Sweden in 1974. He also took the first of his 2 Grand Prix wins at Monaco in 1978, when he diced for the lead with John Watson until the Irishman's Brabham started to lose its brakes.
That was a great win, actually, in that Tyrrell 008, I think, at Monaco, 78 for Depailler. And his second win came at Jarama the following year in 1979, after he'd moved from Tyrrell to Ligier to join fellow Frenchman Jacques Laffite there. Then, when he and indeed Laffite were both in contention for the World Championship, which was eventually won by Scheckter, Depailler had a hang gliding accident, broke his legs, and was out for the rest of the season. You know, Depailler was like that. He was a daredevil. He chain smoked. He took risks. He was brave in the wet, and he was at his brilliant best on street circuits. But, like his hero, Jean Behra, he had no interest in living a safe life. And as you say, Richard, Depailler lived near Clermont-Ferrand. And here's a story. On non-Grand Prix weekends, if the sun was shining, as it often does in that part of France in the summer, he, Depailler, would sometimes take out his Kawasaki Z900 superbike and ride it up and over the majestic public roads that had made up the wonderful charade circuit near Clermont-Ferrand, wearing a pair of shorts and a pair of tennis shoes. And I mean only a pair of shorts and a pair of tennis shoes. No helmet, not even a T-shirt. And he'd ride as fast as he could, getting his knee down, apexing within inches of the rock faces that marked those apexes. Bareheaded and indeed bare-topped. Amazing, crazy, but amazing, don't you think?
Yeah, I do. I didn't know Depailler, but I know quite a lot of people who did, and everybody had, very, very warm feelings about him, that he was a great guy and a terrifically quick driver.
He was both of those things. I never met him, but anyway, I wish I had. When he came back from his hang gliding injuries in 1980, now racing for Alfa Romeo alongside Bruno Giacomelli, Patrick's legs were still in great pain. He struggled in the first two Grand Prix of that season, Buenos Aires and Interlagos, but his legs continued to heal and he qualified 7th at the third race, Kyalami. Then, fantastic on street circuits, as always, he qualified 3rd at Long Beach. And by the way, the Alfa wasn't a world beater. It was also very unreliable, so his race results didn't reflect those qualifying results, sadly. But had he not met his maker in that test at Hockenheim a few months later, he might well have led the Alfa Romeo team to much greater success. Giacomelli, a gentleman who not only liked but also admired Depailler, certainly thought that, and he said it publicly too.
And that feels like a good time to take our first ad break.
Hi, this is Eric Kim with New York Times Cooking. As a recipe developer, I spend a lot of my time trying to come up with dishes that are quick, easy, but also very special. For me, that means dishes like gochugaru salmon. It's a crispy salmon fillet with a salty, sweet glaze that bubbles up in candies. I love cooking this because it only takes 20 minutes. I developed this recipe when I was down in Georgia with my family. It stars a Korean red pepper powder called gochugaru. I love the way it blooms in the maple syrup and the rice vinegar. If you don't have gochugaru, you should totally get some. It's super versatile. It's not just that it brings heat, but fruity sweetness as well. You can get this recipe and so many more ideas on New York Times Cooking. Visit nytcooking.com to get inspired.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
Welcome back. We've talked about two of France's golden generation of F1 race winners so far, Francois Cevert and Patrick Depailler. But actually, two other French drivers won Grand Prix after Cevert and before Depailler, and they were Jean-Pierre Beltoise and Jacques Laffite. Now, unlike the rest of the drivers we're going to talk about today, Beltoise didn't come from the Winfield school. His background was in motorcycling, where he'd won several championships in the early 1960s. He was also a mechanic for the sports car team of René Bonnet, who gave him his first four-wheel race at Le Mans in 1963. And when Bonnet's team were taken over by the expanding Matra company, Beltoise raced the new Matra Formula 3 car with great success and then moved up through Formula 2 before the team entered Formula 1 in 1968 with that epically noisy 3-litre V12 engine of theirs. He took a few podium finishes during his 5 seasons in the French Blue Matras, But it wasn't until he moved to BRM that he took his first and only win in the pouring rain at Monaco in 1972. That was a brilliant victory. He started on the second row, but he'd snatched the lead by the time they got to the first corner, Saint-Devote, and he stayed there for 80 laps.
I'd recommend anyone to go and have a look at that on YouTube. The footage is fantastic.
Yes, it is.
Great win.
It is, in terrible conditions. Lots of people crashed. Lots of others had to stop when their electrics got waterlogged. And the conditions were so bad that the winner's average speed was actually only 63 miles an hour, which was 25 miles an hour down on the average speed in the dry practice sessions.
Nice anorak fact.
I like what Dennis Jenkinson had to say about Beltoise in his race report for Motorsport magazine. Quote, "The little Frenchman was inspired and driving with almost a touch of desperation, giving the feeling that he'd rather die than give up the lead of the Monaco Grand Prix." Unquote. And that would also, rather sadly, be the last of BRM's 17 Grand Prix wins.
There you go. Well, Beltoise was capable, but he probably wasn't in quite the same class as Jacques Laffite, who was the third of France's Formula One race winners in the 1970s, after Beltoise, of course, as you've just described, Richard, and also Cevert, who'd won at Watkins Glen in 1971. Laffite was another Winfield graduate, winning the Winfield Trophy in 1968. Now, Laffite was quick and popular. Happy Jacques, he was known as, wasn't he?
He was.
And I know that tobacco sponsorship is unlawful nowadays, rightly so, but it was a mainstay of Formula One in the 1970s and after that too. And I can hardly think of Laffite without also thinking of Gitane. His 1970s and 1980s Ligiers were beautiful designs, weren't they? Fantastic looking cars.
You're particularly fond of the teapot one, aren't you?
The JS5, the teapot with enormous high airbox. Yes, great car. But I also like the JS11, the JS1115. I can be anorak factish about it. Yeah, I love those cars. Anyway, yes, they were beautiful designs, and their beauty was set off perfectly by the lovely French blue and white livery of Gitane cigarette.
Yeah, and I know we're supposed to disapprove of tobacco sponsorship, and of course we do.
We do.
But, there were some lovely liveries, weren't there?
There really were.
JPS and, the Marlboro cars, whether they were BRMs or McLarens.
Absolutely.
Or Ferraris, dare one say.
Dare one say it.
They always look good.
And even the gold leaf Lotuses, they were pretty as well, were they not?
Yeah, they were.
Yeah. Anyway, when Depailler joined Ligier, his enthusiasm for the title sponsor's products didn't need to be faked, of course, because he was a chain smoker, as I've said. But Gitane's money was important too. It was a state-owned company, and its management always wanted to support French drivers. After Laffite and Depailler, Ligier ran Didier Pironi, Rene Arnoux, Patrick Tambay, and Olivier Panis, of course, amongst others, all French drivers.
Yeah, and here I think we should give a tip of the beret to Guy Ligier, who'd been a very successful rugby player and a slightly less successful F1 driver in the mid-60s before he launched his own team. I always liked the Ligiers too. They were always nice to look at and usually competitive, and they couldn't have been more French if they'd had a string of onions attached to the rear wing.
I'm just visualising a Formula One car with a string of onions attached to the rear wing. And by the way, if someone had told Colin Chapman that it would have conferred downforce, he'd have done it. Absolutely. Or Gordon Murray. Or Gérard Ducarouge, for that matter. Anyway, at this point, we should talk about Renault, I think. We've mentioned the name before, but we haven't focused on it. So, speaking of Renault, let's move on now to the first driver to win a Formula One Grand Prix for Renault. Not a Grand Prix, obviously that had happened even before the First World War, but a Formula One Grand Prix. It's yet another Jean-Pierre, our fourth of the episode, I think, already, Jean-Pierre Jabouille. I reckon Jabouille is one of Formula One's most underrated drivers of all, and I'm going to cite some anorak facts to explain why. The turbocharged engines of those early Renault Formula One cars in the late 70s were incredibly unreliable, ludicrously unreliable. And just listen to these stats. Jabouille started 49 Formula One Grand Prix, finished just 10 of them, and scored points in only 3 of them. But of those 3 point-scoring finishes, 2 were wins. 2. And he was consistently quicker than his younger and usually higher-rated Renault teammate Rene Arnoux, who we'll talk about soon. Here's a stat. Of the 28 Grand Prix in which the 2 of them, Jabouille and Arnoux, competed head-to-head as Renault teammates, Jabouille was the faster qualifier 19 times out of 28, which is a bit of a rout.
Yes, that's a very telling set of statistics. And in our last episode about Gilles Villeneuve, we mentioned that Jabouille will always have a place in history for being at the wheel of the first turbocharged car to win a Grand Prix. And it was particularly well deserved since he was the guy who'd actually done the development work on the Renault Turbo. And of course, as you suggested, that was laughed at when it came on the scene in 1977.
Absolutely it was.
Yep, but 2 years later, there he was, standing on the top of the podium, celebrating that all-French win, even though most of the attention was being taken by an epic battle for second place. And it was even more appropriate, his win, since he'd begun his racing career 10 years earlier at the wheel of a Renault R8 Gordini saloon. He won a second Grand Prix for Renault at the Österreich-Ring in 1980, but a horrible crash in Montreal at the end of that season effectively put an end to his career in the top flight. Later on, you might remember, he joined Peugeot, helping with their successful Le Mans team. Unlike some of the guys we've talked about today, he was never one of the real aces, but, as I said, he has his place in history.
Can I just interrupt with one little story I've just thought of about Jabouille? When many years later he went to the Goodwood Festival of Speed and was asked to demonstrate the Renault RS01, which was the
original turbo car.
Yeah, the 1977 car.
Yeah.
He got in it, and he hadn't been in it for years and years and years. He got in it, and you just saw him looking around the cockpit, and then he started running his hands over the patterned controls, the gear lever, the steering wheel. And he had a little moment, and then he looked up and he said, "Je suis chez moi." I'm at home. Yeah.
How lovely.
Yeah.
And one more fact about Jean-Pierre Jabouille, if you didn't already know this. Mm-hmm. He and Jacques Laffite were married to, and then divorced from, a pair of sisters, Geneviève and Bernadette Cotin. Very French somehow. Yes. Sort of a bit like a Claude Chabrol movie with extra noise and exhaust fumes.
I think you should pitch that to a film company.
An art movie.
Yes. Anyway, moving rapidly on, as I say, Jabouille's teammate at Renault was Rene Arnoux, he of the epic dice for second place at Dijon in 1979, and we're going to talk about him next. Arnoux won the Volant Shell all the way back in 1973, the final year before it switched to ELF backing, and in 1980 he became the latest French Formula One race winner. He was quick too, and of course he won Grand Prix not only for Renault but for Ferrari too. In fact, he wasn't a mile away from winning the Formula One Drivers' World Championship for Ferrari in 1983, a year in which they won the Formula One Constructors' title, of course, because he ended up third, just 10 points behind the winner, Brabham's Nelson Piquet. Shall I say this? Yes, I will. And, of course, he, Rene Arnoux, was and is a much nicer chap than Nelson Piquet. But that's another podcast.
Maybe. And anyway, as we said on the previous podcast, Arnoux really had to work hard to get into F1. He was a working-class lad who'd been a mechanic on other people's racing cars before kick-starting his own racing career with that Winfield Trophy win. The aforementioned Jabby Cronbach was on the jury for the Volant Shell Award that year, and he recalled, I'm not going to do the impersonation. I went down to a corner with Jean-Pierre Jabouille. Rene was the second or third guy through. We saw him arriving, obviously too fast, and the car went sideways, and he caught it in an absolutely beautiful way. Jabouille and I looked at each other, and said, "You can tell the others to go home."
What a great story.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
And actually, you could make a case for Arnoux being the quickest driver in F1 for a period in the early 80s when the turbo cars demanded maximum commitment. His record of 18 pole positions but only 7 wins probably speaks to the fact that he was super quick, but perhaps not the full package, and that maybe his cars weren't the most reliable at the time.
Probably. I always think of him hunched over the wheel, his head craned forward.
His white helmet.
Yes, yes. Great. Anyway, that feels like a good time to take our final break.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC. This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
Welcome back. And we've got 3 more race-winning drivers to talk about in the final part of the show, all of them winners of the Volant Shell or Volant Elf scholarship at Winfield. And the first, Didier Pironi.
Yes, Pironi was a Parisian whose interest in motor racing came about through another French driver, José Dolem, who was his cousin and also his half-brother. They had the same father, and their mothers were sisters. And if that's not very French, I don't know what is.
Some of these family trees are quite confusing, aren't they?
They are. Anyway, José Dolem only started 1 Grand Prix at Watkins Glen in 1974, and he was withdrawn from that after the accident that killed his Surtees teammate, the Austrian driver Helmut Koenig.
One of the most horrible, ghastly accidents.
Yes, terrible. Yeah. But Pironi, his cousin or half-brother or something, had already won the 1973 Volant Elf, and he was on his way to Formula One via the Formula Renault and Super Renault series, both of which he won before he joined Tyrrell in 1978. And after 2 seasons with the British team, he moved to Ligier, where he overshadowed Jacques Laffite, the nominal team leader, and took his first win at Zolder. Ferrari signed him to replace Jody Scheckter alongside Gilles Villeneuve for 1981, but in the car we've previously described as a shitbox, the one we mentioned last week, the turbocharged 126CK, he couldn't match his teammates' 2 wins. They were back together at Ferrari in 1982, but a disagreement at Imola where Pironi defied team instructions and stole the last lap win from the unsuspecting Villeneuve created a rift in a formerly harmonious relationship. And tragically, that froideur, that Cold War, if you like, between the Frenchman and the French-Canadian was still operative at the next race weekend in Belgium, where Villeneuve was killed in a crash during practice. Matt, how do you think all that tragedy and all the controversy that preceded and surrounded it, how do you think that affected the general opinion of Pironi?
Well, I think it did. It absolutely did. And it's interesting because, as you've said, when Pironi was with Laffite at Ligier, he looked super quick as you could get, outclassing or certainly shading Laffite, the more experienced man and the absolutely been in the team forever, as you say. But nonetheless, Pironi wasn't as quick as Villeneuve. Almost no one was. But he was very quick nonetheless, as I say. And Imola 1982 definitely soured journalists' opinions of him, and in turn that caused many fans to think less of him too, I think.
You can only imagine what it would be like if social media had been around then.
Just imagine.
It would have blown up.
Yeah. You would have had to log out of Twitter or X, whatever you call it, for about a week because of the toxicity. Anyway, never mind. But I just want to say something in his favour, because I never met Didier Pironi, but I always remember Marlboro's sponsorship guru, John Hogan, telling me that Pironi was not only a very intelligent man, but also a very congenial one, a very nice man. As I say, I never met Pironi, but I'm certainly prepared to accept Hogan's view because they knew each other very well. And Hoagie, didn't have a reason not to tell the truth about him. Anyway, after Pironi's horrible accident at Hockenheim in 1982, from which his legs never fully healed, he became depressed. Hoagie told me this as well, John Hogan. He put on a bit of weight, and it gradually began to dawn on him that the central enthusiasm, if we can call it that, of his life, racing Formula One cars, was going to remain a thing of the past for him forever. And that's a very tough thing to take for someone like him, because he was another one of our French adrenaline junkies that we've been talking about, and he couldn't stand not racing something, so he embarked on offshore powerboat racing. And in 1987, in the Needles Trophy race just off the Isle of Wight, he crashed his boat, Colibri 4 it was called, after it was destabilized by traversing a wave caused by a nearby oil tanker that, to my completely inexpert mind, probably shouldn't have been so close to the race action.
Or maybe the race shouldn't have been so close to the oil tanker.
Equally. Anyway, Pironi was killed, as were his 2 passengers. Very sad. And here's an anorak fact. After Pironi's death, his girlfriend Catherine Gou, a fashion designer, gave birth to twins. In honour of Pironi and Villeneuve, she named them Didier and Gilles. For quite a long period, Gilles Pironi worked for the Mercedes Formula One team, and in fact, he stood on the podium at the 2020 British Grand Prix to collect the Constructors' Trophy on their behalf. He now works for Ferrari, I believe, on their endurance programme.
And I'll bet he's enjoying it, Le Mans winners.
I bet he is.
So, on. The next driver we're going to talk about is a man who was briefly, oh so briefly, teammates with Pironi at Ferrari in 1982, Patrick Tambay, the man chosen to replace Gilles Villeneuve in the number 27 car. He was another Parisian, and I always thought he was a bit of a man out of time. He was a gentleman driver, sort of looking the part and always nice to have around the paddock, and capable of winning a Grand Prix in the right circumstances, as he did twice for Ferrari, when he helped to lift their spirits after the Villeneuve tragedy. But again, maybe not one of the true aces. What do you think, Matt? Did they have any interesting memories of Tambay at McLaren? Because he spent a couple of seasons there before going to Ferrari.
Well, I think by the time I got to McLaren in 2008, that was 30 years later, really. So there wasn't that many memories from people that I worked with there. But as you say, Richard, Patrick Tambay was a gentleman. But his Formula One career started haltingly. He was brilliant, actually, in a lowly Ensign in 1977. Then, when he was hired by McLaren for 1978, sad but true, he was outclassed in a poor car, the M26, by James Hunt, who, even though James was getting bored by Formula One by that time, but he was still damn quick, in qualifying especially, even if the car wasn't. I think Tambay managed to out-qualify Hunt once in that entire season. Anyway, in 1979 and 1980, now facing a formidable teammate, John Watson, who had replaced Hunt, as Hunt had moved on to Wolff, Tambay struggled more. Now, I've just used the word formidable about Watson. I think so. I think it's fair. The McLarens that Watson and Tambay raced in 1979 and 1980 weren't good. But time after time, Watty managed to drag decent races out of them. And by the end of the second of those 2 seasons, Tambay had become demoralised, and he was sacked. In 1981, the next season, he raced in Formula One again, first for Theodore, then for Ligier, but he got nowhere with either. At Ligier, he had 8 starts and 8 DNFs, I believe. Anyway, then in 1982, he was called up, and by the way, I think he thought his career was over at this point, his Formula One career. Then in 1982, called up by Ferrari to replace his friend, because they were good friends, Gilles Villeneuve, who'd been killed at Zolder, as you've said. Patrick Tambay relocated his mojo, we could say. He won at Hockenheim that year, the day after his teammate Didier Pironi had suffered career-ending injuries, as we've said, and he, Tambay, was second at Monza in front of the Tifosi. And the following year, 1983, also in front of a different set of Tifosi, he won at Imola, and he ended up fourth in the Formula One Drivers' Championship standings. Not too shabby.
No, and I think he did a very important job at Ferrari because their morale was absolutely at rock bottom at the time. You know, they'd had a decent car and they'd had two great drivers in Villeneuve and Pironi. It had all gone south. And he just helped, I think by his manner,
yes,
and his driving, he helped steady them.
I think so. A combination. Yes, he wasn't, going to be the next Ayrton Senna, but he was a solid, nice, professional, unflappable, good chap. Yep. Anyway, after that, he joined Renault, and he bagged a few podiums, but no more wins. However, lest we forget, and I am a little bit of a closet Tambay fan, I did meet him, and I thought he was a lovely guy. I met him much later when he was a commentator, TV commentator. But lest we forget, he won the Can-Am Championship not once but twice in 1977 and 1980 in Carl Haas-entered Lolas, both times. Monster cars, great cars, winning 12 of the 16 races he entered across those 2 years. Definitely not too shabby.
Nope. So that was Patrick Tambay. And I'm sure many of our listeners will know our final name, the one that's been conspicuous by its absence up to now, and that's the most successful of all France's golden generation of drivers, Alain Prost. In truth, Prost's accomplishments dwarf those of the rest of them. He started 199 Grand Prix between 1980 and 1993, and he won 51 of them, along with 4 world titles. That brought him a lot of fans, particularly among a certain group of young drivers looking for a role model. I know his combination of speed with calmness and consistency was a very big influence on Jenson Button, for instance. But Ayrton Senna's fans have a slightly different view, don't they, Matt?
They do. Look, let's just get this straight. Alain Prost was clearly a great driver. His record speaks for itself. He won, as you say, 51 Formula One Grand Prix and 4 Formula One World Championships. But unlike Ayrton Senna, can I allow myself to say this? Yes, because it's true. He wasn't exciting. For some people, and yes, Jenson Button is one. Jenson Button, famously smooth driving style, just like Prost. He did lionize Prost because of his style and his almost his lack of showmanship. But it's hard for me to point to a Prost win that makes the little hairs on the back of your neck stand up when you describe it. Let me put it that way. And this is a revealing anorak fact, I think. Whenever Autosport used to put Prost on its front cover, its newsstand sales bombed. The sales were always dreadful. Now, you may say that Autosport is a British magazine, so that shouldn't be surprising. Well, yes, obviously. And Autosport did indeed always sell well when Nigel Mansell or Damon Hill were on its front cover. But it also sold well when Ayrton Senna, but not only Ayrton Senna, also Nelson Piquet, Keke Rosberg, Gerhard Berger, etc., were on its front cover. The only surefire sales flop was Prost. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and I suppose I ought to be arguing his case, but I confess I've never been a Prost fan either. He was a bit political for my taste, and I was never sure that the Professor was the right sort of nickname for a Grand Prix driver, or not the kind of Grand Prix driver who appealed to me. Anyway.
Yes, it's a good point. Professor. That's a chess grandmaster, not a Formula One driver.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I do have a very vivid memory of the post-race press conference at Donington Park in 1993, when Senna, of course, produced his masterpiece of a drive to win the European Grand Prix in the rain, driving a McLaren that was in every way inferior to Prost's Williams. And afterwards, Prost was trying to explain to the press why he could only finish a very poor third. And he gave so many excuses that I was half expecting him to complain about the ashtray in the cockpit being full and slowing him down. And I remember Senna turning to him and raising an eyebrow and saying, "We can swap cars anytime you like."
Perfect. What a rejoinder.
But, well, maybe that's not being entirely fair. Le Professeur was, definitely quick, no doubt about that. And his winning percentage was fantastic. And he was the most successful French F1 driver of all time. And if he didn't stir my blood, then maybe that's my loss.
Yes, I know, but I know where you're coming from. And I don't want to, upset legions of Prost fans. But I wasn't a big fan either. And I suppose this is another podcast, actually. He was a truly dreadful team boss when Ligier became Prost. I mean, ham-fisted, out of his depth, and too often, what's the phrase, economical with the actualité. Anyway, but he was a great driver and he won 4 world championships. But he hasn't managed to excite either Richard Williams or Matt Bishop, it would appear. Anyway, that completes our list of what we're calling France's golden generation, the 10 drivers who all became Formula One race winners within an incredible 11-season run. But actually, the Winfield school wasn't done with producing Formula One drivers or indeed Formula One race winners, and even a champion after that. In 1983, both Jean Alesi, who was French or French-Italian, Sicilian, and Damon Hill, who wasn't French at all,
Damonil,
came through the Winfield school. And 4 years later, Olivier Panis, another French Grand Prix winner, graduated as the school's top driver. And actually, Panis's victory in the 1996 Monaco Grand Prix for Ligier stood as France's last Grand Prix victory for almost 25 years, until Pierre Gasly won at Monza in 2020. Anorak fact.
I remember Panis's win in Monaco with great affection. I was there, and 12 out of 22 cars eliminated by accidents on the wet track, no one hurt, 7 classified finishes, and only 3 cars still actually moving when the checkered flag came out. Now that's my kind of Grand Prix. Marvellous.
Yes, and David Coulthard wearing Michael Schumacher's helmet.
Was he?
He was. Anorak fact. There you are.
That's astounding.
In a McLaren. Go and Google it. I promise you it's the case. Anyway, the significant thing about Panis, well, many things, but here's one, was that he was one of the last drivers to receive support from both Elf and Seita, S-E-I-T-A, the government-owned parent company of Gitane and Gaulois cigarettes, through the La Filière driving scheme.
See, in those days, the government made cigarettes.
I know.
Fabulous.
Anyway, Panis says he'd never have made it to Formula One without it. But when that sponsorship dried up, tobacco sponsorship was banned, of course, grassroots motorsport in France started to suffer. And when Panis left Formula One at the end of 2004, France was left without a Formula One driver, which seemed a remarkable thing at the time. I suppose the point I'm making is that financial backing makes a huge difference in motorsport, particularly grassroots.
Yeah. Do you think we'll ever see one country have so many different winners in one decade or so again?
It's a very good question. Hey, how about this, Franca? Maybe China one day. But that's definitely another podcast.
Provocative, yeah.
Well, you never know. China might suddenly grow a fantastic interest in Formula One.
Yeah.
And one of the sports I love, much smaller sport, snooker, the Chinese have completely, they haven't taken over, but they have absolutely embraced it.
Yeah. Interesting. And they've got the resources, of course,
yes.
if they fancied it.
The number one Chinese player, snooker, is called Ding Junhui. And when he started, there was one snooker club with a very poxy table in Shanghai. Now there's 1,500 snooker clubs in Shanghai. Okay. So, if something like that happened to motor racing in China, I could see there being 6-8 Formula One drivers from China on the grid in 2040. Yeah. There you are.
Okay.
Anyway, moving away from China, which, as I say, is very definitely another podcast, I'm going to give you a poser here. If you had to pick one of our golden generation of French drivers as your favourite, and I know it's not Prost, who are you choosing, Richard? Who are you going to choose?
Oh, that's easy. Jacques Laffite. Happy Jacques. Nicknamed after a song by The Who, which is quite nice. Yes. And it was a good nickname because that's the impression he gave. Happy in his work, Nice smile, good hair. He was the one my wife always fancied.
By the way, what's this good hair business? There's nothing wrong with having no hair.
Okay. Luckily, we're not being televised at this moment. No. Good hair. And we were in the crowd opposite the pits at Brands Hatch in 1986, in fact, when he got involved in a multiple shunt at the start, which stopped the race. He smashed into the barrier just past us, and he broke both legs so badly that his racing days were over after 174 Grand Prix, that's a lot, and 6 wins, not bad. He was good value, was Jacques.
He absolutely was, and, but he wouldn't be my choice, probably, if you're going to ask me.
I am. Your favourite?
Well, it's between two.
Oh, come on, come off the fence.
I'm going to tell you why. So Francois Cevert, simply because, he is one of the most beautiful human beings that has ever trod this earth, and a great driver. But really my favourite, Patrick Depailler. Patrick Depailler, because of his devil-may-care attitude, his gutsy determination, the fact that he came back with very painful legs to outclass Bruno Giacomelli, no mug, in a Alpha. And he died the way he was always going to die, because he left no margin and took no precautions. And that was Patrick Depailler. I never met him, but I would have loved to have done so.
Vive la France. And that feels like a great place to say. And colossally, that's history. And bring this very Gallic episode to an end.
Yes, and if you'd like to share your thoughts on France's golden generation or any of the other subjects we've touched on in the series, you can get in touch via podcasts@the-race.com or via social media. I'm at the Bish F1 and Richard is at rwilliams1947. And remember, if you want to enjoy ad-free listening or treat yourself to some Colossally merchandise, there are links to both in the episode description.
So that'll do it for this week. Until next time, with thanks to our tireless producer Johnny Reynolds, and for you for listening, it's au revoir from me.
And it's adieu from him.
And colossally, that's history.
The Athletic.